gradual accumulation of increasing legitimation.
Well, I'm not going to say that that people coming out to their families is irrelevant, because I think that it is actually very relevant. But my evidence for the claim that the left flank is crucially important in historical moments like the one we're in now is that, and it's a correlational argument, I have to say. I mean, like any historical argument is. But if you trace, for example, the history of the women's suffrage movement through the early women's rights conventions of the 1840s, through the doldrums, where they didn't understand solidarity anymore and were horrible and racist, and then coming into the 20th century with new leadership, and then right then there was the war, the First World War in the 19-teens, and at that moment another group arose, the National Women's Party led by Alice Paul and some others, and they started picketing the White House for equality and also questioning the war. I see so many similarities between what they did and what GetEQUAL is doing. And that is when the tide turned on the question of women's suffrage, is when Wilson was put the thumb screws. Then, and of course they had to go to jail and hunger strike, and if you've ever seen the movie Iron-Jawed Angels, it's a pretty good one. Similarly in the civil rights movement, okay, so you have the SCLC who achieved incredible things. I mean, incredible, and okay, was so much more radical than people ever gave him credit for, which I think is why he was assassinated, when he started advocating for poor people, right, and expanding the purview of the civil rights movement. But as that movement, and you know, he also realized that he couldn't organize in the North in the way that he organized in the South, and that these urban youth were building their own movement, and it was a movement that didn't want to take any more police violence, and were going to start arguing self-defense. And there's this, again, Eyes on the Prize. If you haven't watched all 14 episodes, you really have to, because it's kind of amazing. It tells some truths that I didn't think you would ever find in American mass media. And one of those, in addition to the Ossie Davis one, is when Stokely Carmichael, leader of SNCC, advocate of Black Power and armed self-defense, is marching in the March Against Fear with Martin Luther King at the front of the line, and they are marching, but they are arguing the entire way. They are having like a real movement tactical discussion, right? And then when people start shooting at Martin, they have to dress like him as decoys. And Stokely Carmichael is like the first person to put on a blazer to be a decoy for Martin Luther King Jr. Yeah, we don't know these things. So and Stokely Carmichael in that same march was sending people ahead and asking them, come back and tell me, are they going to buy Black Power? We're going to drop the slogan Black Power. I don't know if it's going to work, Black Power, but we're going to do it because I think it's time for that. And it's going to be, I mean, he's basically saying it's going to be the left flank of the movement and it's time for that. And let's see if the timing's right. And he talks just like that. And so, very fast, he sends the guy out and he comes back, yeah, Black Power, Black Power. And he says, I need a more sober analysis. I sent an idiot out there. So they very carefully plot and plan and start to put in, you know, in 1966, 67, a number of shifts in the understanding of civil rights, including the song Freedom Got a Shotgun. But, I mean, in all, it was mostly threat and posturing because it was about self-defense. But anyway, long story. Then there were riots. Then there were the riots in the cities, and it was right during that time when, well, in 1965, when LBJ, there's the Voting Rights Act of 64, and there's one in 68, and in 68, that one comes on the heels of all of that increased rhetorical and tactical kind of intensity in the movement. And so I can think about a lot of other social movements. The labor movement is very similar in this regard. And that's why it frustrates me so much when people should play a role in the more moderate or the flank. I mean, the point is we shouldn't bash each other. But I do think that historically there is correlational evidence for what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, actually I have a similar question. And looking at some of the same examples that you were giving, it seems also that the rise of the left or the flank tends to push the mainstream component of the movement even more mainstream, right? So if we're looking at suffrage, the National Women's Party pushed the Christian women's temperance movement to be even more conservative, to say, oh yes, you need to give us suffrage so that we can pass temperance movements and Victorian era standards of sexuality, and so they tend to then emphasize their mainstreamness even more as a result of the rising flank. And so, do you think that may also attribute to some of this? Like, I'm thinking also maybe the LGBTQ movement. I'm talking really fast because I'm excited about what I'm thinking. Sorry. Right, so as soon as we see the flank start to rise, we also start to see some of the mainstream, like HRC, start to talk about civil unions, and so we see this kind of compromise position happen. Or with the birth control movement, when they wanted to legalize birth control, we start seeing that be more about it's good for mothers, and this will create good motherhood, right? So it seems like the left may also make the mainstream more mainstream.
Okay, I don't have a theory about this, but there's something weird about the progressive era that took economic and social political demands and turned them into moral ones.
Yes.
That I'm not sure that was a consequence of the rise of the left wing. Because in other movements, you see, I mean, because the HRC isn't retreating to civil unions now. With the emergence of GetEQUAL, they've adopted this. I mean, for a long time, they wouldn't have said marriage equality. You know, they would have, they would talk about civil unions or same-sex marriage or something. But then to bring in that discourse of marriage equality, they added that, and so I think the mainstream became pressured toward greater reformism rather than retreating. And I don't know about those other. I mean, because you can think about the settlement house movement, you can talk about the muckraking, you can talk about Sanger. I mean, so I don't know.
I'm not sure exactly how to ask this, but I mean, what do you think? What are your thoughts when you think about the LGBTQ movement? We tend to, I think, couch it, at least from what I've seen, we talk about it as either Stonewall or post-Stonewall. And what do you think it does in terms of perspectives or assumptions with the movement by not sort of making the history bigger, like going back to the Mattachines or the Daughters of the Lights, because we have such a bigger history than Stonewall, post-Stonewall. So what do you think it does in terms of understanding the broader trends of the movement itself? Because I admit that I always sort of start with Stonewall and go from there, but then I always get frustrated too, because I'm like, gosh, why can't we just talk about the law, the broader history, and why that?
You know, I'm thinking about, I mean, I love the way that John D'Amelio writes about this, for example, and I'm thinking of that book, Gay New York.
George Chauncey's.
Yes, and I'm thinking about, oh, I can't remember what it is, but basically talking about how that we would call the LGBTQ or queer or whatever now, but and Warner might say the movement for those engaged in non-standard intimacies. So that's about as close as I can come to actually nailing a label there. But anyway, that all of that had to be so clandestine before the war, and it was the social relations of the Second World War that altered the conditions of possibility for visibility recognition, also policing. So, and that's kind of a Foucault thing. So because of sort of the homosociality of the military, first of all, the emergence of many working class women into the world of paid labor, the shift in gender roles that accompanied that temporarily, and there were other socioeconomic factors that they talk about. And then, so when the Daughters of Bilitis and the Mattachine Society were operating in the 50s and in the bars and underground, that I think it started the momentum then to, because so the policing and the surveillance were really quite intense also. And so that at a certain point, people were going to decide that we're not going to take that anymore. And that turning point happened in 1969 because I think of the conjunction of that event with the peak of all of the other social movements. You can tell that when the GLF emerges from Stonewall. So that, I mean, I think that Stonewall marks a really important time where first there's a clandestine kind of organization, then there's a shift in social relations and economic relations, and then there's more visibility and more policing, and then policing provokes self-defense, and then there's all this discourse of liberation and fighting back going on around. And you know what's interesting about Stonewall too is that the people involved in Stonewall were very much like the people who today are arguing against equality as a goal. And in terms of just really down and out street hustlers, youth, kicked out of their houses, you know, transvestites, what they would call themselves, and so on, and very much not sort of the middle, not sort of the, you know, HRC kind of gay people, and I think that model that generated their economic needs and their social exclusion generated a kind of a radical tone to that event, and it was not just a riot, of course. I mean, it was a rebellion, I think, and it just heralded the future. I don't know if that helps, but there is definitely a deeper history, but it's a quieter history, I think. I don't know. What do you think?
No, I agree. It's like, you know, I always try to sort of think about, okay, that's a turning point, but then, you know, the broader context is mixed. A lot of people, especially the youth, when I think about, you know, educating the youth too, it's like, wait, you know, you have to understand the earlier history, but Stonewall was such a key marker that this is why we're having the conversation now.
And there are other events like that, like the Compton Lunch Counter sit-ins, which I don't know as much about, but there were other sort of explosive moments. Yeah. So.
Yeah. Well, so to give someone else a chance.
Please, go.
Okay. Well, first of all, I really appreciate this. It's very timely, actually, for me, because I've always been, you know, a strong supporter of marriage equality. But then, maybe just like a few months ago, came upon the Against Equality website, and I was like, oh no, I'm doing the wrong thing. You know, because I understood, you know, this argument against reproduction of the heteronormative privilege, just in a different format. So I really appreciate this sort of like third way and the solidarity, and thank you for settling that issue for me. But my question, I guess, is more around the rhetorical strategies. I noticed that there was a shift between talking about gay marriage and talking about marriage equality.
Yes, I think that's
and
true.
that I would suppose accounts for that big polling shift that we saw. But I'm curious, as a researcher, like how would you sort of explore that correlation, if you could, or if there's any other, you know, I don't know, explanations or ways to trace that, I guess.
I'm sure there are. I have not done that, so I don't know the answer to the question, but I think that I or anyone else could pursue this sort of ideographic approach and try to find that moment when the preponderance of mentions were marriage equality rather than gay marriage or same-sex marriage, and then to see how that matches up with polls or something. But I mean, and I'm not good at that kind of design of a study, so somebody would have to do that or help me. So I don't know. I mean, I'm sure that directionality is a thing, though. Like, what causes what? Does the shift in polls sort of lead to a shift in the language, or it's a dialectical relationship? And I don't know.
Do you think that was a rhetorical strategy of
GetEQUAL?
Yeah. Because, right, you can't say you're against equality, that's un-American. So, like, they forced people to...
But to pair marriage with the word equality and to give it that substance, I'm just not sure exactly when that started happening. So,
We can open up that question to the floor after Freya has
yeah, anybody from the floor can answer questions.
Yeah, I mean, my question actually is relevant to that issue. It sounds to me like one of the things that you're identifying in the GetEQUAL movement as being sort of desirable or in solidarity with the left flank of the movement is the kind of the articulation of a kind of a utopian vision, a utopian vision that lends itself well to certain kinds of critique and activist strategies that we associate with kind of far left tactics. And I'm wondering if you would, I mean, I guess my question has two parts, which is, do you see that same sort of articulation of a utopian vision in the left flank of the movement? And if so, how is it different than the kind of utopianism associated with an ideal, like equality, or the way that equality functions as an ideal? Not just for the kind of center of the movement, not just for the GetEQUAL sort of branch, but also for the more conservative people who are also sort of, you know, marching marching under the bandage of marriage equality and really, doing everything they can to take advantage of the idea.
Control it, but they're not.
Yeah, right. So, yeah.
So yeah, I mean, interesting. I'm not really regarding the anti-equality movement as a flank of the movement. This is going to betray my suspicion of postmodernism and everything third wave because I'm so old school. But Marx has this pamphlet called The Indifferentists, where he talks about people who abstain from struggle in the here and now and what's actually going on the ground because it is too ideologically impure, and that we can't get involved in that because to get involved in that would mean sacrificing our utopian vision, right? So there's a kind of an ideological flanking, but it's not actually a movement flank. And I'm not saying I don't want to completely dismiss its arguments. I have a really good friend who's also in the field of rhetorical studies, Carmen Chavez, and she and I are dialoguing about, she's a proponent of the anti-equality movement, and so, but generally, I do see kind of GetEQUAL as the left flank of Gay Incorporated, and that the anti-equality movement is a deconstructionist movement, and there's a place for that. I don't think right now is the time for that, but the argument's going to come up, and I think it's healthy.
I'll follow up on that because I was thinking the same thing in terms of you call it the separatist in your model. You identified that as sort of the separatist frame, and I think I heard you use that frame to describe the people who did Stonewall, right?
Mm-hmm.
Did I get that right?
Mm-hmm.
You sort of equate that?
Yeah, I did actually start to say that, yeah.
Yes, I thought you did. So my question to follow up on Freya, I'm not sure if this is what you meant, but I'm curious about what would a strategy look like using that frame, right? This idea of, not that it's indifferent, it is indifferent, but indifferent with attitude, right?
You mean the anti-equality movement?
Yes, and let me tell you the other reference that I'm having for this. There are Africanists who are using this, who are post-colonialists, who are using this same kind of strategy to think about approaches to development throughout the African diaspora and solidarity throughout the African diaspora, right? What if you to put this in the frame of thinking about race in terms of white privilege and that sort of thing. What if you acted as if this whiteness didn't matter, and what does that do to fuel a vision of for strategies and so I'm putting it in that frame. So
You've got my head spinning. So
I'm sorry.
No. First of all, I would never argue that this whiteness doesn't matter. I mean, that's...
No, that's what
okay.
I'm just saying. It's a strategy. It's a sort of a tactical move, if you will, that goes from this indifference that is just saying, okay, I'm not going to be taking part of this whole equality thing. I don't care about that. But indifference, so I said, with an attitude, I don't know how else to put it. And I'm just making it up right now.
For me, difference with an attitude is better than indifference with an attitude.
All right.
And I think Stonewall actually was that kind of a thing where it wasn't just passive, like bourgeois society doesn't understand who we are and we're not going to do that. It was basically a critique of the police state and a critique of gender norms. But people were out there on the street beating police up, and not that I am a little giddy about that, I confess. But because they had taken so much abuse. But they articulated a kind of a working class agenda that then expressed itself in very many organizational forms. There's the GLF, there's the Gay Activist Alliance, which I think later then takes the more moderate road and becomes the NGE, National Gay and Lesbian Task Force. I could be wrong, so the movement goes like that, out of Stonewall. And I wanted to say one other thing about indifferentism and deconstruction. I mean, I'm all for deconstruction, but I was teaching a class on social movements, not at my own university, and, you know, every term had to be deconstructed before we, social had to be deconstructed, then movement had to be deconstructed. And I'm talking about gay rights and marriage, and they say, okay, gay has to be deconstructed, then lesbian, then bisexual, then trans, and then queer, and then marriage, and then rights, and that's the political work that they wanted to do in a Rhetoric of Social Movements class. And for me, being an instrumentalist in terms of my own perspective in rhetoric, like I think rhetoric is meant to do things, I was very frustrated. And the other thing about indifferentism is about the fact that so many people's actual lives are benefited with health insurance, with people's pensions, being able to keep their house, being able to keep their children, being able to have health care, which has been an issue in my life. And yes, of course, we should have universal health care, right? We shouldn't have to get married or have a job to have health care. But okay, but right now, in the here and now, with people's actual bodies, people suffer because there is not marriage equality. And I think that, and the immigration issue is so important too, because people's families get deported. They can't, if you're married to someone from another country, or espoused or partnered, you can't bring them to live with you in the United States because they don't count as your spouse for immigration purposes. And there are just all kinds of seriously beneficial things that are not bourgeois or you know, normal. It's not, those people can bring their spouses here and be as abnormal as they want to, right? But you know what I'm saying? There's no reason to give that up. But there's just these benefits that come. In addition to the massive remaking of the national imagination. I didn't answer your question. It was too hard.
Rich?
No, I mean, I just want to say, I think that what Pat's saying is really important because if, as someone who's watched this since the gaze on the military debate, meaning from before the time of the invention of domestic child and the imposition of domestic child, it does seem to me that, you know, that it seems to me now that a kind of indifferent disposition around that was arguably the most populous, the most, maybe numerically significant position among people who were potentially involved most directly in that, meaning gays and lesbians in this country. So I mean, I think that's a really interesting historical issue.
What I enjoy about GetEQUAL, they were totally behind the campaign to end Don't Ask, Don't Tell, but not because they loved the wars or the military, but because their partners, their family members and friends had been persecuted, and that changing the gender culture of the military could do a lot of good in a lot of ways. But of course, but it's just an opportunity then for conversation about the wars and about the role of the military in society. And a lot of people in GetEQUAL in Austin are former service members who, through the process of demanding Don't Ask, Don't Tell, got radicalized and more confident about asking for more and more and more. And that's another thing about social movements that I think people forget, that winning small victories, you know, you think, wow, I could ask for more than that. I mean, you know, and that when you ask for more, you get the small things, you're like, wow, I feel pretty much more confident in that. And you think about the Montgomery bus boycott in this perspective and so on. And the other analogy I like to make is that, you know, people who sat in at lunch counters did not want the egg salad sandwich. You know, like it wasn't about the right to eat. It was about a fundamental shift in the organization of society. And I think with marriage, it's kind of like that for me.
Right. Looks like we're just about out of time. So I'd like to thank Dr. Dana Cloud. Thank you all for your participation. We'll be heading to Linda's, which is a bar across the street on Franklin, for a happy hour for the next couple of hours. And if we don't see you there, we'll see you bright and early tomorrow morning for the rest of the conference. Thanks.